Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm doing another charcoal landscape. I hope you like it. Let's have a look. This is the sketch phase, and with landscapes it doesn't really take much. All you have to do is create some kind of an idea where all of the main elements will be. I'm going to have some trees in the foreground and a river and some trees in the background on the other side. That's about it. Now let's go over the materials quickly. I'm going to be working on paper which is about 8 times 12 inches in size, and it's about 190 GSM in terms of quality. I'm going to be using a combination of charcoal pencils and vine charcoal. The charcoal pencils are Kohinoor Gioconda charcoal pencils. I'm mostly going to be using the soft charcoal pencil. For blending, I'm going to use tortillons, brushes, my finger occasionally, I guess. And for erasing, I'm going to be using a Kohinoor pencil eraser and a kneaded eraser. I started with these trees in the foreground, and because most of the tree trunks are in the shadow, I made them fairly dark. And I'm also using my tortillon to draw some suggestions of trees in the background behind them. I'm going to be doing a lot of drawing with a tortillon, because even though a tortillon is a piece of paper rolled into a tip, you can use it for drawing. It picks up some of the charcoal dust, charcoal powder, and then you can use it as a sort of a pencil, I guess. But I use it for softer marks which don't need a clean edge or texture, or don't need to be very dark. And it can be very useful for those objects in the distance, because these usually have less value, less contrast and less texture. So a tortillon can be very useful to draw these trees in the distance, for example, to create that atmospheric effect, because the objects in the distance become less and less detailed. I also have to worry about clean edges here, because I can't have rough or a blurry edge around the tree trunks. I want them to stand out nicely against the background. And I'm going to draw a lot of foliage here. The way that I'm going to draw foliage is a little bit difficult to explain, but it's just a bunch of short pencil marks that kind of look like leaves or clusters of leaves. So it takes a little bit of practice, but you can also observe how other artists do it and maybe try to imitate those shapes. Now I'm going to be using a combination of a couple of tools for this. I'm going to use the soft charcoal pencil, but I'm also going to use that vine charcoal stick. I'm going to be using that a lot, because that's also very useful when drawing foliage. The reason why I'm using a soft charcoal pencil so much for this area here, normally you wouldn't necessarily start with some of your pitch black or darkest areas, but here in the left corner on the left side, I have a lot of these trees and canopies which are in the shadow, or at least large portions of them are in the shadow, so I have to use my darkest values for that. As I move further onto the other side, onto the river and those distant trees on the other side of the river, I'm going to be using lighter and lighter values. Now, this part of the canopy I covered a little bit more carelessly, and I'm also drawing some of the other larger branches and boughs and other tree trunks. going to be refining their shape a little bit. But the thing is that it doesn't really matter that much because a lot of them will be obscured by all the foliage. So I think I had a similar drawing in a way, where I did some overhanging bare branches, over the river. The scene was somewhat similar, but the trees were on the other side, and there was also a rocky bank, and there was also some kind of a stream or something, but it was an autumn scene, I think, with virtually no foliage. This one is going to have a lot of foliage, so this is like a summer or a spring scene. Now the reason why I could cover this a little bit more carelessly was because I'm going to refine the edges a bit later. I just want this area to be pretty dark, so I first define this large dark area, and then I'm going to be adding some more indications or suggestions of foliage around the edges in order for that dark blob to make more sense. The tree in the foreground here, its tree trunk is going to be a little bit lighter, and not all of it is going to be in the shadow, mostly the parts that are just under the canopy, because the canopy is kind of casting a shadow onto the tree trunk, or at least some parts of the tree trunk. And it's also going to have a little bit more texture. You can already see a bit of texture on the trees in the background, but they are mostly in the shadow. But the one in the front is going to be a little bit more complex, and we're going to see a little bit more of that tree bark. And now I picked up a piece of vine charcoal. Vine charcoal is a natural charcoal, and it has some interesting properties. It's not as dark as compressed charcoal from your charcoal pencils. But the thing is that when you press hard and when you don't smudge it, when you don't do any blending, it can look almost as dark. And I can now combine those strokes with a vine charcoal stick, with the work that I already did with a soft charcoal pencil, and I will create something that doesn't look too dissimilar, and then eventually I will do some refining with a pencil eraser. The reason why I'm going to use a pencil eraser is to poke some holes into that canopy so that I can make it look like the light is coming through, and also to draw some of the lighter foliage in the canopy, because not all of it can be dark, not all of it can be in the shadow. The canopy has a very irregular shape, with some of the branches sticking out, branches growing every which way, and the leaves or clusters of leaves which grow on these branches, which are sticking out, which are getting more light from the light source, are going to be lighter, and the ones that are deeper in the canopy, those are deeper in the shadow, they aren't going to be visible. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm also varying the amount of pressure that I'm using so that I can deliberately make some of them lighter, others a little bit darker. And I'm also trying to vary the shapes and the sizes and the direction in which I make those strokes. So I want those leaves to look as natural and as random as possible, because if you keep making the same stroke, it's not going to look natural at all. As you can see, I have some trees in the distance there behind those trees here, and I've also made some suggestions of textures and details on them as well, because I don't want to oversimplify them, and there's going to be some more trees behind them, and there's going to be some more stuff behind them, which is going to be even simpler. And when I was explaining how I use Tortillon for drawing distant objects, I mentioned the atmospheric effect. What that means is basically that when you look into the distance, normally the stuff that is in the foreground and the midground is going to be a bit darker, and it's going to be a little bit more defined. It's going to have a little bit more texture, and there's going to be more contrast. But the stuff in the background is going to be usually a little bit lighter, more bluish if you're working with colors, and it's going to be less defined. It's going to have less texture, and it's going to be there's going to be less contrast. So there are several things you need to remember when drawing landscapes. And by the way, now I'm drawing some even more distant trees in the background. You see how I'm kind of stacking elements, making those in the distance lighter and lighter. So there's another group of trees here behind these. It's even further away and smaller and a little bit lighter. And then there's maybe a wooded hill or a mountain behind all that, and it's almost barely visible because it's a lot lighter. I'm not going to do much with the sky, by the way. I'm not going to do any clouds or anything like that because there's no need. Much of it wouldn't be visible anyway, and it's going to be obscured by the canopy of this tree and its overhanging boughs. So back to what I was saying about some important things when drawing landscapes. It's important to create that feeling of distance and depth, because you wanna make the viewer feel like they're looking at a real scene in nature, something that has depth and dimension, and so that the objects look three-dimensional. And in order to do that, the first and the most obvious thing to do is obviously to make sure that the objects in the foreground are larger than the ones in the background, because of the point of view and the perspective. But there's more to it than that. The trick is to try to stack the elements in such a way so that the elements which are in front are drawn in front of the other elements, so that they kind of push them back into the distance and suggest the feeling of depth. And of course, as I've already mentioned, the way you draw these elements, these trees and rocks and mountains, is also important, because you want to use more contrast and more texture for the objects in the foreground, and you want to have virtually no texture on the elements which are way back in the background. Now this tree is going to be growing on this near the river, on this rocky shore. I had, when I was drawing a similar thing with a mountain scene, there was some pine trees, and they were also growing on a rocky terrain. I had some silly questions from the viewers who asked, is it growing out of a rock? Well, it's not growing out of a rock, but there are lots of rocks around it, but obviously the trees and their roots always find their way. So this tree is mostly surrounded by these rocks and stones, and that's what this left bank, left side of the river is going to look like. Now this other part of the background to the right is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a little bit taller and also a little bit different in terms of terrain. So the terrain on the right was mostly flat, but in the distance and here on the right, we're going to have some hills, or maybe like a small mountain, maybe, I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out what its exact shape should be. Now there's one thing that I forgot to mention about that mountain way back in the distance. I actually wanted that to be a lot lighter than the rest of the scene, so I used a graphite pencil for that. The rest of it was done in charcoal. and normally I just use a graphite pencil for sketching. I use a 2H or an H graphite pencil to do the sketch. Here I didn't have much of a sketch, I just made some indications where the trees will be, and that was enough to start, I guess. But after that I kind of moved on with charcoal. Now here on this wooded area here on the right, I'm going to make some indications of individual trees, although because they're kind of grouped together you can't really define them, you can't really and that's a problem, I think. You can't really define their canopies well enough, so it's a little bit confusing even to me, but it's going to be confusing to the viewer as well. But the reason why it's a problem for me is because I don't really know how to convey it to the viewer, because I'm not really sure how to define the individual canopies. But what I can do, I think, is because this is some kind of a hill, I can try to define the tops of those canopies so that they're a little bit lighter, so that we have some indications of that terrain, so that we can feel like the hill is going up and there are more and more trees which are growing one on top of the other, or one above the other, I guess. But because they're all in the distance, they're going to be getting smaller and smaller, and because they're grouped together, it's going to be kind of difficult to discern individual trees. So I'm going to try to simplify this a little bit. I first tried defining some of the individual trees to see what that's going to look like, and eventually I didn't really like the appearance, and I decided to blend it in a little bit more thoroughly so that I would make it blurrier, because I really didn't want to have too much detail or texture in that area which would compete with the stuff in the foreground. I'm going to do some work using a combination of charcoal pencils and the pencil eraser as well, trying to create some variation in value. But like I said, I probably spent a bit more time on this part of the drawing than I should have, because sometimes just less is more. But I think it turned out okay eventually. The objects in the foreground are going to be what draws the focus of the viewer immediately. So that's where I'm going to have to focus most of my effort. So like I said, eventually I used brushes to soften all of these textures, and during that process some of those details were lost. But then I went back in and sort of started trying to define the tops of some of these trees, just so that I could give the viewer some kind of a feeling of the shape of that terrain. Because if you can see treetops stacking one above the other, then you can kind of feel like we're looking at a hill which is covered with a forest. And then I picked up this vine charcoal again, and I proceeded to draw some more of the foliage, because these branches are very long and they're kind of growing all the way to the other side. So that's going to be the main focus of this landscape. Now, as I speed this up, it looks kind of easy, but I guess it takes a little bit of explaining, so I'm going to take a few minutes to explain how I draw this foliage using a piece of vine charcoal. But I'm just first going to draw a few more branches just so that I can have some kind of a structure here, so that it doesn't look like these clusters of leaves are hanging in midair. But let me tell you something, some of them should be hanging in midair, because the viewer can fill in the gaps, because some of these twigs and branches are so small and tiny that they won't be even visible. So if you have some of these leaves or clusters of leaves that feel or look kind of detached from the others and aren't connected with smaller twigs, it doesn't really matter, that's fine. We can just imagine that there are some smaller twigs there which we can barely see. Now let me explain the technique here. The reason why the vine charcoal stick is so perfect for this is because it allows you to make these pencil strokes which vary in terms of shape and size, which kind of look like foliage. And what you want to do is you want to keep changing the direction of your strokes. You want to rotate the stick a little bit so that you always make a slightly different shape, because if you keep doing the same stroke and you keep making the same shape, it's not going to look realistic at all. You want the foliage to be flying all around and to be kind of facing every which way, and to do that you have to let your hand go, and you have to let that vine charcoal stick produce all kinds of different shapes which vary in terms of their size, their direction, and everything else. So that's what the canopy looks like, and I can always go back and maybe add a few of the smaller branches and twigs in between those clusters of leaves, just to make that a little bit more realistic. And here on the left I added another branch here because I didn't really like the shape of the tree, so I decided to add something more in front of those trees. And I also added some more of that lighter foliage in front of those darker tree trunks, because that will create an extra feeling of depth, having those lighter leaves in front of that darker background. Now I don't want to have this bank, this rocky bank, consist all out of rocks. So I'm going to draw a few bushes here in the foreground as well, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the foliage on the tree as well, but maybe a little bit thicker, a little bit more dense. And I added some touches of darker value using a charcoal pencil. I also used a pencil eraser to add a bit more texture and some lighter details to that tree trunk, so that it too would look a little bit more interesting, a bit more three-dimensional. And after that I decided to add some details to the surface of the water. There's a lot of these smaller stones and rocks, on both sides of the river. So right now I'm just making some indications of their shadows, not drawing the full shapes, because the light source is usually coming from above, so there's going to be always a little bit of shadow under each and every one of those rocks. I can maybe try to make draw some suggestions of that rocky bank on the other side, as well as some reflections around some of the rocks. I'm going to draw the surface of the water mostly with vine charcoal. I'm going to make this part of the water on the right a little bit darker, while the one on the left will be a lot lighter. And I'm also going to add a bit of value to this part of the bank here on the left. I'm going to blend everything with a brush, and then I'm going to put in some details a bit later, maybe do a little bit of refining. I'm going to draw a few more rocks here. And maybe some light suggestions of ripples here and there. Because of the reflections on the water, some of them are barely visible in the distance. The ones closer to the foreground are going to be a little bit larger and more visible. Now it's time to add some darker value to this part of the river here, because it's mostly in the shadow, and there are some darker reflections as well. And also I can use my pencil eraser to add some suggestions of ripples and some sparkling water that's reflecting the light. Initially I tried drawing some highlights on some of these stones and rocks on the other side, but I felt like I was producing a bit too much texture and that it was a little bit too distracting, so I decided to simplify it a little bit, mostly using brushes, because I wanted it a little bit more blurry because it's in the distance. And I kept adding some areas of darker value in that water as needed. Eventually I decided to draw a little bit more of these rocks here in the foreground. If you want to know how to draw rocks, I have a video on that. It's not as complicated as it looks. All you have to do is try to produce some random shapes and try to stay more or less consistent with the light source. The light source is coming from above, but it's coming more from the left here as well. Now here I just made some suggestions of what this rocky terrain should look like, but eventually I'm going to be adding a bit more value and defining those rocks a bit more. And naturally I'm doing all of this work with a soft charcoal pencil, because one of the advantages of charcoal is that it's easy to build up areas of darker value very quickly, but also because charcoal is so easily moved around, you can easily modify it and kind of work with whatever the charcoal pencil produces. You see, the cleaner the medium, the fewer of those happy accidents you have. When you draw with something that's kind of messy, like charcoal, you'll have a lot of happy accidents. And what I mean by happy accidents, and Bob Ross often used that term, is some random shapes, some random values, in which you can maybe recognize something that you want to create. So do a bit of scribbling about, dragging your pencil here and there, and you create some random shapes, and you recognize something in those shapes, and you realize, well, maybe I can use this and turn it into something. Well, that's the way it is when you're drawing rocks and foliage and trees and things like that. This is especially the case when you're drawing landscapes, because when you're drawing things like portraits, obviously you need a lot more precision and you're trying to capture the likeness. Here you don't have to worry about these things. This is way more relaxing, and you can just allow for more randomness and spontaneity. So as you can see, I'm adding some darker and darker shadows or values in between those rocks to kind of deepen the cracks in between them and to make them more three-dimensional. But I think that this whole area in the lower left corner is still a little bit too light. I'm using my pencil eraser to add some suggestions of ripples here and there and to refine the appearance of the surface of the water. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I just have to try to create something that kind of looks convincing. But like I said, the the whole area to the left, or in the left corner, is a little bit too light, because I feel like there should be a little bit more shadow there. So eventually I added a bit more texture and shadow using my charcoal pencil. I didn't capture all of the drawing process on camera because sometimes I lose a little bit of footage here and there for whichever reason. But if you want to see longer videos, I mean like really long, real-time, full-length videos, you would want to check out my Patreon. I have literally dozens of full-length videos there, all kinds of stuff. But if you don't want to do that, you can browse through my videos here on my YouTube channel. I have lots of landscape drawings as well as other kinds of drawings. Don't forget to subscribe and give me a like and comment, because all of these actions mean a lot for the growth of my channel. And also don't forget to check out the other videos. I've drawn a lot of landscapes. I'm just making this other side of the tree trunk a little bit lighter, so that maybe it can look like there's a little bit of reflected light, or maybe some light coming from the other side. And I'm just putting down some finishing touches on this, adding some more details on the other side of the river. The drawing here is done. I've removed the tape, as you can see, and I'm just going to put my signature down. I'm just going to put my signature in the lower right corner, just to kind of balance things out, because I have more stuff in the upper left corner. And that's it. I think it's time to put the pencil down. I want to thank you for watching. Don't forget to check out my other stuff. I'm going to see you in the next video. Bye for now.